Hello, today we are going to look at federalism and how that is embedded in our system of government. So, federalism is a system in which two or more governments exercise power over the same people and the same territory. If you look at one of the earlier videos we discussed in terms of the systems of government, it's closely related to a federal system. Um, but you have the national government, you have state governments, and you also have local governments that all exercise some power over the same people in the same area. So, why would our country want to turn to federalism? Well, there are issues between those who wanted more power for the states and who wanted a strong national government. Remember, we had the Federalists and the Anti Federalists, and the solution to the debate about ratifying the new Constitution not only involved the Bill of Rights, but it also involved a federalist system. Okay, the national government has some special powers over all citizens, while states have powers that are reserved for them, and they also have powers that they share. So, in looking at powers of the national government, you really have three types. You have delegated powers, express powers, and implied powers. And your delegated powers are going to be written in the Constitution, and they're granted strictly for the national government. Express powers are directly stated in the Constitution, and if we're looking specifically at the legislative branch, those would be the enumerated powers, or they spell out what Congress can and can't do. You also have implied powers, which are powers that require the government to carry out the express powers. Okay, so for example, when the Constitution was being drafted, they could not foresee that there would be space exploration and nuclear weapons. So there are certain things the government needs to do that aren't stated in the Constitution that deal with topics like that. For state and local governments, you also have what are called reserved powers, and those are powers that strictly belong to the states. Okay, so states have authority over matters that are not listed in the Constitution. Their powers include the ability to conduct election, support schools. They can regulate businesses and trade within the state. Now, if it's business or trade across state lines, then the national government will have authority over that. And you also have concurrent powers, or powers that are shared between both the national government and the state governments. So those are the powers that the national government and state governments carry, but there are also powers or things that all levels of government cannot do. Okay, and some of those include taxing exports, passing retroactive laws, holding a person in jail, or sentencing a person to jail without a fair trial. They can't grant titles of nobility, which I think is interesting, because you don't ever think of the United States having titles of nobility today, but this would be the reason why. And state governments cannot pass any law, or the national government cannot pass a law that violates the Constitution. In Article 6 of the Constitution, there's a statement which is called the Supremacy Clause. It basically establishes that laws passed by Congress and treaties of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. And this goes back to the idea that the Constitution must be respected and followed, because it is the highest thing in a country. It is the most powerful, the strongest living document, or the strongest document that governs a country. So this Venn diagram kind of shows you different powers that are granted to the national government, the state governments, as well as both. I'm not going to hit all of these bullet points, but I'll just kind of briefly touch on some of them. So powers given to the national government include regulating foreign and interstate commerce. They can admit new states and govern territories. They can create roads, post office. They can establish federal courts, the Supreme Court. They can listen to ambassadors from foreign nations, things like that. If we jump over to the other side, looking at state governments and the reserved powers, they can establish local governments. They can support public schools. They can provide professional licenses, set the rules for marriage and divorce. And then in looking at concurrent powers, they can levy taxes. Both the national and state governments can levy taxes. They can charter banks, borrow money. They can enforce, make, and interpret laws. And they can protect the rights of citizens, to name a few. But hopefully this kind of gives you a better picture of what some of the powers are that are reserved for each. And looking at public policy, federalism is closely tied to public policy. Public policy is really just a stated course of action for how the government is going to tackle certain problems. And state and local policies can be a way to test these new policies that might be addressed at the national level. So, for example, Georgia was allowed, or was the first state to allow 18-year-olds to vote. And now it's a national law that 18-year-olds are allowed to vote in federal elections. Colorado was the first state to pass sunset laws, which basically was a way for laws to expire after a given time. And Florida was the first state to pass sunrise laws. With federalism, we also have national policies where it works kind of in reverse of how I just explained it. So the national government sets a policy and then the states are going to follow it. So an example would be the civil rights movement, Brown versus Board of Education, the idea that segregation is illegal and unconstitutional. Because the federal government ruled that it was unconstitutional, the states then had to follow that decision. You also have national power and looking at commerce. The federal government can use different pieces of legislation really connected and connect it to commerce in order to institute policy. So an example would be the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Basically, the federal government, in passing this piece of legislation, said that discrimination really restricted interstate commerce. And because of that, discrimination needed to be fixed and it was unconstitutional. So they passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. You really have two views on federalism. One view is you favor state and local government, or that's the states' rights approach. In that sense, you really follow the Republican Party, the Tea Party, or the Libertarian Party, or the Libertarians. And the reason being is state and local governments are closer to the people. So by giving them more power, really the people have more power in government. And if you oppose if you're for the states or oppose the national government, you really don't like the amount of regulation that is put in place by the federal government. The second view favors the national government, or it's the nationalist position. This would typically be your Democratic Party or the progressives. The argument is you need a strong national government, and with the supremacy clause, the national government should be stronger than the states. And the reason being is it's better equipped to solve major social and economic problems as well. Federalism, it's important to our system because it really helps people get involved. So it increases the opportunities for people to participate in politics. You don't only have to, you don't only get to vote in federal elections, you can vote in state elections and local elections as well. It also provides better access to government leaders. It allows for people to work with special interest groups. And it's really focusing on the belief that if you participate, you can actually have an impact on public policy, even if it's at the state or local level. Thank you for listening today.